So I'm Sable Boroff, and I'm here at Triangle Square, and I'm going to present my talk today on Queen Elizabeth I, who was one of the most amazing women in history and one of the greatest rulers, not men, not women, but rulers that England ever had. And she was born in 1533, and she died in 1603. And her mother was Anne Boleyn, who we all know. Her mother's was killed by King Henry VIII, who was her father when she was 2 years old, and she was immediately declared illegitimate for the throne when he got rid of Anne Boleyn. And but she was raised as a boy. She had a magnificent education. She learned Latin and Greek and arts and science. She learned rhetoric, which she wrote all her own speeches. She was a magnificent speaker. She wrote all her own speeches as queen. And then later on, she was put in the Tower to accusations of treason. Mary I, who was not Mary, Queen of Scots, was her half-sister. And she was queen, and Elizabeth was accused when she was young of treason against Queen Mary I. But later she was exonerated. She almost lost her head in the Tower, which would have been a terrible tragedy. But she was set free later and came back to court. And when Mary I died, she named Elizabeth as her heir. So in 1558, she became Queen of England. And just as a little background, in the 1400s, now in 1558, she became queen. In the 1400s, they had the Black Plague in Europe, which forever changed the face of history, because 1/4 to 1/3 of all European people died in the Black Plague, and it was all due to the Catholic Church saying cats were evil. So they killed all the cats. The rats went crazy. The rats had fleas, and fleas carried the plague. So it was really the cat's revenge on the Pope. But anyway, so the Black Plague killed a lot of the peasants. And and England was a very poor little country at that point. And the Black Plague killed a lot of the peasants who they relied on to work the farms. Now, that was actually good for the peasants that were left because they had more power because there were fewer of them to work, so they got better conditions. Some of the peasants actually became landowners, which was completely impossible prior to that time, but they had to treat them better because there weren't enough people. So, and when she came to the throne in 1558, and she was Queen of Ireland too at the time, and England was bankrupt. They had almost no money in the treasury. 10 years later, they had a big surplus, and that was due to Elizabeth's frugal policies of spending. She was an extremely wise ruler. I mean, she really was a great ruler. She did a lot of transatlantic trade. She had an amazing legacy. She did a lot of transatlantic trade. A lot of her exploration, Sir Francis Drake, who we all learned in high school, Sir Walter Raleigh, they went around the world stealing. They were basically pirates, and they stole from the Spanish Armada. Now, Spain was a world superpower at this time. England was they had no power, very little navy, but they went and stole from the Spanish ships, and they got rich that way. And they harassed the Armada, but the Armada had a fleet of a lot of ships. And one of Elizabeth's greatest victories was the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. This is one of the greatest English military victories of all time, and it was due to Queen Elizabeth. The Armada had 130 ships, 26,000 soldiers, and in their navy. They were trying to invade England. Now, when Elizabeth came to power, she was there was a war in England between the Protestant and the Catholics. Henry had started this by freeing himself from the Catholic Church and creating himself as the head of the English Church, which the Pope was furious about because he didn't want to lose any power. But surrounding England, the countries were all Catholic. And they hated Elizabeth, and they wanted to get her off the throne so they could put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne, who was Catholic and would return power to the Catholic Church. So she was surrounded by enemies from the moment she came to power. And there was practically civil war in England when she came to power between the Protestants and the Catholics. And Elizabeth did brilliant work in managing that situation so that there was peace in England between the two factions. I mean, brilliant work. And she created a church that was intermediate between the Catholic and the Protestant, and she didn't allow persecution of either one. So people were able to live with each other without killing each other. Now, there was a lot of conspiracies from the Catholics, but she really tried to keep peace about religion. And she also started the Dutch East India Company, which later on made England a world power after she died, and traded all over, and they took over India later. But she started that in her reign. She also was a patron of arts and sciences. Shakespeare was there when she was there. She encouraged theater, literature, music. Some of England's greatest writers were in that period of her, Spencer and Donne. And she encouraged theater. When she encouraged the Renaissance in England. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what was going on with the people at the time. Now, we had a lot of peasants who were the majority of the country. The nobility was like 3% of the country. The rest of the country was very poor. They worked very hard. They had terrible conditions, and they had very bad working conditions. London and cities were like sewers. They had garbage, literal shit, dying animals in the streets, sewer in the street. They had no sewer systems, no showers, no refrigeration. I mean, it was, and disease ran wild, you know. Any disease, as we all know now with modern sanitation, is spread by dirt. And so it was very bad for the poor people. And they had two kinds of poor people. And also the economy was changing. They were changing to sheep. So a lot of the peasants were thrown off their lands, and they came into the big cities looking for work and couldn't find it. They were homeless. Their children were homeless. And they roamed the streets of the city unable to find work. So it was really a very bad situation. And also, she created the poor laws. There were two kinds of poor people in Elizabethan England, the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. The deserving poor were the elderly and orphans and sick people, and the undeserving poor were people who they thought just didn't want to work. So the undeserving poor were whipped and sent back to their villages. They had no sympathy for that. And the deserving poor went to the poorhouses, which were pretty terrible places. And it was up to the church and the rich people to try to take care of these poor people, but they didn't really do a very good job. Anyway, and also, so there's some interesting things about what people, what life, I did want to partly talk about what life was like during this period. So the things were extremely different for poor people versus rich people. Rich people had a life expectancy of about 42 years. Poor people, it was 25 years. People died in childbirth. Children and teenagers died all the time, and everybody was expected to marry. Nobody got off that hook. And everybody wanted a lot of kids because a lot of them were going to die, and they needed them for farming and stuff. So everybody had a lot of kids, and women were absolutely expected to marry. And and there were women who weren't married were held in great disdain, and they were really suffered because they had no way to work. They were called witches sometimes, which we all, probably have heard about that. And women were definitely less than men. They were under the thumb of men. And women who were independent were also called witches, and they burned them at the stake. This is one big reason why Queen Elizabeth never wanted to marry, because even she would have been under the thumb of a husband, and he would have had to run the country, and she would have lost power, which is why she didn't want to marry. And but she also improved literacy rates during her tenure as queen. A quarter of the people could sign their name. When she died, a third of the people were able to write and read. And the poor people had very limited schooling. Girls didn't have schooling at all, usually. Rich boys went to university, some of them, and they were able to read and write, but the poor got a very limited education, and just the boys. The girls were basically taught how to do household stuff and get ready for marriage. The rich people ate meat, food spoiled. They used herbs. They used herbs to conceal the smell of the rotting food. I mean, this is life, okay? We got to appreciate what we have now with refrigerators and everything. And also, so the poor ate eggs, very few vegetables, bread. The poor got dark bread, and the rich people had white bread. That was, the status symbol in those days for bread. Now it's just the opposite. The dark bread's supposed to be healthier for you. Well, in those days, the rich people had the white bread. And there were very strict laws about who could wear what kind of clothing. They were called the clothing laws. The rich people could wear, silk and jewels and furs. They could wear red and purple and, bright blue. The poor people were allowed to wear wool and linens, but they had brown and red clothing. They weren't really allowed to wear the fancy fabrics, and if they were caught wearing fancy fabrics, they could lose all their property and all their money. And I don't think these laws were strictly enforced, but they were on the books, and in court they were enforced. But I don't know about in the land areas. And
was this only in England?
I'll take questions afterwards. So another So another thing that's very interesting, and also they had a lot of sports, and they had a lot of festivals. And when Elizabeth came to power, there were 2.8 million people in England. When she died, there were 4.1, so the population almost doubled. The city of London grew to 200,000 people. It was the largest city in England. The next largest city was only 15,000 people. But people were crammed into London. It was very, very bad. They were crammed in there with no sanitation, etc., like I said. One of her speeches that she gave, now when they defeated the Spanish Armada, the Spanish Armada came to invade England. They were trying to kill Elizabeth and make it a Catholic country. She gave the speech to the troops at Tilbury right before she sent them out to battle. And she said this, and she wrote this herself: "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England, too." And she inspired the troops. They sank 5 of the ships, and the Spanish got so panicked that they ran away. And this is, fantastic, because England was terrifically outnumbered. And also, England, as I said, when she came to power, they were very poor, and they had no world prestige at all. But when Elizabeth died, they were much more important nation in Europe than they had been, and they were one of the world's powers. And she really upgraded England tremendously during the 44 years that she reigned. I wanted to talk about some of the festivals that they had. The Ascension was one of the big festivals that they had. When she came to power, they created this festival of her ascension. Now I have to look at my notes here. And 1570, they created this Ascension Day. And this was a huge celebration. In London, they had theater, music, parades. This was celebrated for 200 years after her death because the people loved Queen Elizabeth. They loved her. They felt like she was sacrificing and not getting married, and that she was mother to the country and to them because she cared so much about England. That's why she didn't get married. So the people loved her. And that's a big festival that they had for 200 years after her death. And also, they had 12 days of Christmas with Christmas carols, singing, and festivals and music. They had Shrovetide, which is a huge feast before Lent, and that was the origin of Mardi Gras, which they have in New Orleans and other places. So they had all these festivals, and the sports that they had were archery, bowling, wrestling, bear and bull baiting, dog and cockfighting, hunting, and hawks, with dogs and hawks. And a lot of the sports and the whole nature of the country was very rough and violent. And there was a lot of gambling too. And and also people were violent with their children. Children were often beaten as discipline. It was considered normal and commonplace to beat your child if they misbehaved. So it was very rough times. The other thing I wanted to mention, I read a whole book about this. Elizabeth started the first spy network, the Queen's spies. So they were called Watchers. And, she was surrounded by enemies. The entire Christian world, which was mostly Catholic, was out to get her. They wanted her dead. So she had a network. Walsingham was her spy master, and he had this elaborate, enormous network of spies in all of Europe. He had them all over Europe. He had it in the capitals of Europe. He was with the common people. He had spies. Had his tentacles out everywhere, and they cracked codes, and they captured dissidents, and they tortured them until they told everything they know. It was the first surveillance state, and so one of her spies signed himself 007, and Ian Fleming, who wrote James Bond, uses that to create the character of James Bond. His number was 007. And one of the things they did, Mary Queen of Scots was the other heir to the English throne, which was a constant threat to Elizabeth her whole life because the Catholics wanted to kill Elizabeth to put Mary on the throne, and the fact that Mary was alive was an incentive to them to kill Elizabeth. So Walsingham tricked Mary, who was imprisoned at this point, and he tricked her. I mean, there were spies trying to reach Mary and say, listen, we'll kill Elizabeth for you, and then you can become queen. And they were writing her notes and leaving in her beer cases, and they intercepted these notes, and they caught Mary conspiring with these spies, and they Elizabeth was very reluctant to have Mary killed, but she wrote an order to have her killed, but she didn't want to use it, and because she was very reluctant to kill another queen and set a precedent like that. So Walsingham snuck behind Elizabeth's back and had Mary killed, and she was dead and beheaded. And Elizabeth was furious, and she never forgave Walsingham for that because he took it on himself. And really, I think he did the right thing, because as long as Mary was alive, Elizabeth's life was going to be in danger. But she was furious at him because she had signed the order, but she didn't want him to use it. So after Mary died, she went on to live quite a few more, Elizabeth went on a few more years and did a lot of good things. And when she died not naming an heir because she had no children. She was known as the Virgin Queen. Sir Walter Raleigh called the state of Virginia, he named it Virginia after the Virgin Queen and Queen Elizabeth. So the name stuck. But anyway, James I of Scotland became king, the first of the Stuarts, I think. And he became king because there were nobody else after Elizabeth to continue the Tudor name. So anyway, she was an amazing woman, and I'm happy to talk about her. And I'm going to stop now and take questions.